Today I'm here to talk about the God plot. The God plot's so named, I didn't call it the God plot. We were running these community allotments, and of course word got around all the allotmenteers that here I am, a pioneer minister, so what does it become called? Oh, that's the God plot. But it seems like a perfectly apt and adequate description of what is actually going on there. We base the model of what we do around seven sacred and special spaces, which in turn is based on a document that I first read from George Lings from the Church Army on 7 sacred spaces of monastery. And these aren't necessarily physical spaces, but they are, in one sense, intentional spaces that we create, sometimes in the same physical space and sometimes not in the same physical space. So if we run through those in turn, please, on the slideshow again, please. So if we have the next slide. So the first one, the cloisters. Well, the cloisters is that interface, if you want, between our space, our allotment spaces, our 4 allotments, and the rest of the allotments. It's the paths down. We've very conveniently got our 4 plots right at the entrance. So most times people pass us by. And we get to interact with people, even if it's just with a wave. But quite often people will come on when we've got teas and coffees, and they'll come and say hello, and we'll have those chats. But the cloisters is that interface, if you want, between our space and the world. And it provides a very handy neutral space, if you want. For those who don't feel like they want to come into our community, they can still remain on their own, in their own space, as it were. It's a public path through the allotments. Next slide, please. The garden, which is probably the most obvious of the spaces within an allotment, when all's said and done. The garden is about growing things. And like on any other allotment, we do grow things. This week, we've just produced a whole load of runner beans, which in turn then go back to Tabor into the food hub so that they get distributed amongst the local community and those kinds of things. We're going to have a series of apples, no doubt, coming up soon because the apple harvest is almost ready and all our trees in the orchard are coming into bloom with that wonderful fruit. So we produce food on the allotments. But the garden is not just about, which sounds strange, growing things. It isn't just about the food that we grow. The garden space in that model of 7 sacred spaces is making sure that there is this balance between work and rest. So actually, even when people are only there for 4 hours on a Wednesday, we ensure that the garden isn't just work. Garden is there to be worked on, but also to be enjoyed. It's there to actually experience, as was talking earlier, some of the awe of just being there in this space, right in the middle of, right by the side of Harry's Road, with ambulances and all kinds of things zooming up and down, but finding a quiet space to listen to the birds, to appreciate the parakeets, as we actually have flying over sometimes from Longley Park, of looking amongst the undergrowth and all those things, and just experience that whole sense of being there. So next slide, please. The refectory. Now, the refectory is again obvious in one sense. It's where we do food. We do that in lots of different ways and at lots of different times. Sometimes we actually do meals where we will come to gather as a community and eat together. And hopefully now I've received dispensation through conference to do communion, and we'll be including that as part of what we offer on the allotments as well. But the refectory again is a part where it's about offering hospitality. For many people, the refectory may be the first stage that they encounter after they've braved just coming beyond that cloister space. So once they've come onto our plot, for many people, they may only come on for a tea or a coffee and a bit of a chat. That may be their experience of the allotments. We've got a guy, David, who comes every week for that. He'll stay with us for an hour. He'll smoke his cigarettes. He will have his cups of tea. He will have some support and chat, and then he will go again. He'll tell us about his latest hospital appointments, all those kinds of things. For him, that's how he interacts with that space. He hasn't grown anything. He hasn't helped to do anything on the allotments as such. But for him, that sacred space that he values, that special safe space that he values, is the refectory and that interaction that he manages to get in that space. The next slide, please. Chapter, and here's a wonderful picture of Terry and Brian enjoying a cup of tea in our shed. But the chapter is where we develop a sense of culture as a community on the allotments. So it's where we decide what we're going to be doing, what we're going to be growing, how we're going to grow, what projects we're going to take on. So over the period just after the lockdowns, we were working with the youth group who built us a new pizza oven, and now we're building as an outdoor kitchen. All those kinds of discussions happen in what we would call the chapter. It's where we set the rule, the tone, the ethos of what we are trying to be on those allotments. It's where we set the nature of our community, I suppose. Next, please. The Scriptorium. Nothing very fancy, I suppose, for us really, but it's where we do our creative bits. So as well as the day-to-day gardening on the allotments, we will also spend time from time to time doing things like the mosaic. That was our lockdown fox that we did during lockdown. Well, at the end of lockdown, not during lockdown, obviously. We had the lockdown fox. We've also had decoration of the pizza oven, where we did some clay work to decorate the pizza oven. We've had painting sessions there. We do writing sessions there. We use the space in a way that is beyond simply an allotment space. And that's where our Scriptorium is that creative element that we try to bring in to the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month routine of the allotments. Next space, please. There should be at least two more, I believe. Yes, there are. Chapel, which to us in church may seem the most recognisable, I suppose. And the chapel is where we do our celebration and worship. So that could be anything from Lent and Advent study groups that we've sometimes had running there, right through to the celebration of Candlemas, solstice, apple wassailing even we've done there, and all within that context of a worship environment where we are worshipping God. Different people who come to us will come from different traditions and different faiths, non-faiths, and all that is understood and recognised. It's also recognised that I am there as a Methodist pioneer minister, and that's the tradition that I bring. And so it's all done openly and honestly, but it's done in a way that celebrates creation, that celebrates God, and that celebrates our love for creation. And that's the primary thing behind our chapel space, if you want. Sometimes we will have larger public gatherings like the picture showed with Laura playing the guitar, where we'll have seasonal celebrations around solstice in particular, and equinox time. And we'll have maybe 30, 40 people turn up on the allotments to hear music, hear poems, hear prayers, and all those kinds of things going off. And I know some of you, especially Ali, Ali's even sung at one, I believe, haven't you, if I remember rightly, yeah. Yeah, so they're a genuinely fun occasion where people just come together and celebrate. Next slide, please. And this is, I think, the last space, the last of our 7 sacred spaces, is the cell. The cell is the place where we go to withdraw, to be on our own with God. And so we have, and we encourage people to take time out on their own in those spaces, on the allotment spaces, to take time out on their own, to sit and to just be, to have that time out to be with God, if that's how they see that experience, or just to be with their own thoughts and be amongst nature and creation. And people do take that time. And sometimes they'll use special spaces that are set up. We have a particular space at the far end of 76, which is far away in the corner, which is basically this old tractor tire with a seat on it and a wall built up around it, and people can sit on that, and it's a solitary space, because the cell is this solitary space where we're left to encounter ourselves and ourselves in relationship to God, or however we want to see that. As I say, some of those are actual physical spaces. Many of them aren't. They're constructs, if you want, that we use to be able to achieve a balance for what we're doing on the allotments. And in many ways, they're also constructs that I bring into my wider pioneer ministry, looking at what we do in Tabor and elsewhere, to try and achieve that kind of a holistic, balanced approach to how we are people of God together. From a climate and environmental point of view, I think the benefit that having those allotments has brought to us isn't so much just about, as I say, the food that we have grown, although that has made a difference, and our involvement in other food projects and food waste projects, and it has fed into that. But more importantly, I think it has given those people who come an ability to actually reconnect with something that they haven't got. Many of the people who we come across haven't got their own gardens. They haven't got their own spaces to be able to sit in. Even during COVID, they weren't able to sit in gardens and meet under rules of sixes and all those kind of things. They could in that space. And I think one of the most important things that having that space offers is being able to give a collective communal space in nature where we can come together and build community. And so I think that's what I want to offer you today, because although it might not be something for every single church to want to take on 4 allotment plots, I can understand that. I'm sure that many of you will have spaces in and around your church buildings, garden spaces, that actually you could use more constructively, that you could see your outside spaces as important as your inside spaces, and that you could start to create ways of making that work. And I know Joyce was also talking about a church, was it Firth Park or was it another church? But anyway, it doesn't matter which church, where they've actually got a wormery and everybody brings their cast-off bits of household, shavings, potato peelings and everything else, and they bring them to church to put into the wormery, which then produces fertilizer, etc., etc. These are tiny things, and I agree entirely with what Joe said earlier about when you look at the scale of the problem, these are tiny things, but they are tiny things that help to reattune our brains and our hearts and our souls to a world that isn't simply about consumption, a world that is actually about working as part of creation, as Nick said. And what we do outside of our buildings is just as important as what we do inside our buildings.